The shadow is not at all 100% evil. I have already mentioned that in criminals sometimes they have even noble personalities as a shadow. But even in the ordinary man in our civilization, the shadow is very often a kind of harmless brute of the more natural man. The man without good manners, the nature person, but not at all an evil person, and even something which likable and very important to have with one. Our ego and by our education forced to wear a lot of masks and to behave in a unnatural form, and therefore we repress all sorts of natural animal reactions and simple human reactions out of politeness and good manners and whatever the situation requires. For people to learn to know their shadow and to live their shadow a bit more, it makes them generally more accessible and more natural and more round and human altogether. People without shadow who are perfect inflict an inferiority on their surrounding and irritate their surrounding. And that's why one is so relieved if something nasty happens to them and say, thank God he's also only human. I've noticed that analysts try to be very correct with their patients, but sometimes there's a slip-off. And I've often noticed that when I produce a real slip-off in an analytical hour and the patient can make me powerful reproaches, it improves our relationship, because the analysants feel, oh, after all, von Franz is only human, and now I feel above her and I'll pardon her. That's a good feeling. And then one has a more natural human being to human being relationship. The shadow is really our best social function. It integrates us into the group. With our good qualities, we are above the group. With our shadow, we are man among men and human all to human. And that's why the shadow is very often in dreams represented as something important, or which one should love or accept or not scorn, but fully accept within oneself. We say about somebody what they say has no weight, or they as a personality have no weight, and that is somehow they have no psychic solidity, no substance. One doesn't feel the other person as somebody substantial, and that comes because she doesn't. What gives us substance, strangely enough, is our shadow. Our shadow is the positive thing. That girl's shadow is weightless because she does the washing of the dirty linen outside. That means probably she enjoys a lot of gossipy, criticizing other people among colleagues and so on, but never takes it home. She never takes it home to herself. She never asks, and me, what am I doing to the others? She hasn't realized her shadow yet, and therefore her other personality is weightless in a negative sense. Now the shortcut practical solution, if your shadow annoys you, is to avoid him, to go away and have your flat on your own, to not live with Sue. That would mean the most practical thing is to repress the shadow. You see that when you want to talk to people about their shadow, they just switch conversation. They say, oh, by the way, I wanted to tell you, and they talk about something else. That's the practical way of getting rid of Sue. But it's not really practical. It's practical at the moment, but one pays for it later. Many North American women are very unhappy, basically because of the whole way of the social life in North America. It is not enough rooted. People move too much about. Women have very little chance to establish roots to the earth, to a garden, to a house, to a community, to a surrounding where they can stay. It is this constant moving which rather pleases men, but is very unfortunate for women. And that damages the women's instinctuality, and then they want to replace it by sex, because that is then, so to speak, the last possibility to have something to do with their own body or to confirm their own physical existence. But it's a desperate move which is a surrogate for something quite different, a surrogate for having no feminine life, no feminine rhythm of life. The whole rhythm of the North American life is too hectic for a woman. It damages women more than men. It's not good for men either, but it damages women even more. And then there is this whole world of advertising and this whole social idea of success and girls having to date boys and inquiring in, are you dating a boy already, and so on. And it is all, so the whole relationship between the sexes becomes an affair of success, of social achievement, instead of feeling. And if a woman has not a strong relationship to her own instinctual feminine nature, then she falls for that kind of nonsense. Women can run sex with the head, so to speak, completely cool, without feeling, as a means to confirm their self-esteem. I must have a man, I must have an affair in order to prove myself to be normal, and because one should have that, because it is a success to have a man in one's pocket. But it has nothing to do with the instinctual, real feelings of a woman. She overruns those with theoretical idea of having to have a man and having to have sex. And then the whole thing is a cold power game which leads to nothing. And then she runs a success life with trying to conquer men and putting them in her pocket and boasting to her girlfriends about it. And it has nothing to do anymore with her real feminine feelings. When there is an emotional commitment, there is at once conflict, and then one is easily hurt. If one is emotionally and committed with one's feeling to a human being, then one risks a lot of misunderstandings and hurts, because even the best partner will hurt you from time to time. You are exposed, you are vulnerable, you are dependent. And such women don't want to go into that. They are afraid of it. They are afraid of the complications of the heart, so to speak. And they prefer to run it like a cold businessman. Just have the pleasure of it and goodbye. Nothing to do with you personally. Because it is also a rejection of the feminine fate, because it has always been the fate of women to be personally interested in the man and to be therefore vulnerable. And what about losing your partner? What about your partner going away with another woman? What about your partner traveling for years in foreign countries and not returning to you? That is the eternal pain of women, because women want a lasting personal relationship, and men very often do not care about it, or have a life, or lead a life where they cannot care about it too much. They have to attend their own business. And that is a tragedy between men and women. And such women who don't want personal commitment want to escape that tragedy. They want to escape suffering, and they get into much worse suffering naturally. Well, I think that as far as there are still Victorian prudishness around, that is a good idea, but it is the least of the problem, because I would say that is now achieved. In our modern world, a woman can live her sexual life as she likes, and so that is no longer the problem. Now comes the much bigger problem, namely a liberation of the heart. That is that's the program of the next 50 years. There are two possibilities of human connection. The one is technical, by the boss and the employee, the tram, the bus conductor and the passenger and so on, and that is organized by rules, and even organized nowadays by psychological rules. There are training programs for managers, how they manage the employees and so on, and that is all rationalized. And the one thing which is always left out is the liking and the disliking. And the feeling reaction, for instance, what does not count. A woman would sometimes like to say, this sounds all very logical, but I have a strong feeling against it. No, nobody would put any attention to that nowadays. If she cannot formulate it as a logical deduction, just to say my feeling instinct tells me this is no good, then one just ignores it, one walks over her. And men do the same thing. Men have feelings too, but they ignore them. They think they have a funny feeling in their stomach, and they think, oh, that is a jet lag or something, and they rationalize it away. They don't listen to the reactions of the heart. And that's what so many so-called primitive people or so-called underdeveloped countries, people of underdeveloped countries, reproach us, quite rightly. because whatever their shortcomings are, they listen more to those feelings. To an Australian Aborigine, you could still say, today I have a bad feeling, I won't move out of the camp. Or, that fellow seems to make a very good offer to us, but I somehow don't like him, and therefore I'll keep away from him. That you can tell still to an Australian Aborigine, but if you say that to a white American businessman, he'll just think, oh, well, women. Well, feeling is my inferior function, so I have certain trouble to articulate that. But the feeling function is something which is completely neglected nowadays. Now, generally, we identify feeling with affect and emotion, but that is only inferior feelings. For instance, in the happenings of young people, musical happenings, they liberate their feelings, but it mostly comes out in strong emotions, and it comes out as a feeling of loving everybody or destroying everything in a kind of all over the place way, not individually pointed, while differentiated feeling is to love that unique person for its uniqueness, which presupposes that you are capable of seeing the uniqueness of the other, of getting rid of all schematic psychological judgments, of being able to, it is ultimately something irrational and has to do with one's own development. The more one becomes a unique individual oneself, the more one individuates in the Jungian sense of the word, the more one becomes only able to also see the other person as a unique person and not have some cliché judgment about them. If you listen to how people gossip about each other, you can notice that 80% of what they say about the other person is a cliché slogan and does not hit the uniqueness of that person. It doesn't define the uniqueness. So liberation of the heart would mean to become slowly capable of feeling and sensing the uniqueness of the other's personality and to love that uniqueness. And that doesn't mean this Christian all-pardoning, sweetie pie, strawberry sauce love of just all loving and pardoning everything. It means, on the contrary, a very great precision of feeling, namely I noticed that people with differentiated feeling, if one talks to them in a not quite genuine tone or makes even a not quite genuine gesture of the hand, they are already shocked. They feel the uniqueness and they want you to be yourself. I think that's the most important thing for a psychologist, for instance, to love the genuine person of the patient and to be quite openly disliking all what is not genuine in the patient. Then it brings out the other, it brings out in the other what he or she really is, or is really meant to be by nature. And that is real love, to love a love which heals or makes the other person whole, which makes the other person more him or herself. And that has nothing to do with sentimentality or being just sweet or polite. Well, I think it's the best possible thing, because otherwise, historically, it's the families who have arranged marriages for money reasons and power reasons and family politic reasons, as it's still partly done in India and has been in good families in China and so on. And that isn't very favorable either. Then I would say rather let fate play. And then it is projection, and in many cases, if the people are instinctually healthy, they do not only project, they have a healthy instinct choosing the right partner. And if there is not a father image or a mother image disturbing the situation. And then I can say, even if it goes wrong, then they have learned something. And if you had prevented them, they wouldn't have learned anything. They would have remained blind puppies. So I think projections and error and possible divorce is sometimes a detour which cannot be avoided. It's tragic and very sad, but we are now, for the first time in history of mankind, experimenting with free love. Because in primitive tribes, it is all tribal arrangement or family arrangement. and has mostly a status background or a background of distributing the possessions and so on. Marriage has nothing to do with love, originally as an institution. And we can't do that anymore. It's too impersonal, it's too collective. So if we want to find personal relationship, we have to experiment ourselves. And I think we will have to go through a lot of painful suffering and men torturing women and women torturing men till we wake up to a possibility of relating better to each other. It's a unique experiment in history. It's begun with the Cour d'Amour in France, when the knights could choose a woman they loved and serve, and where they had free love relationships in Western civilization. But promptly the Catholic Church has repressed it again. There were too many illegitimate children and family complications and inherited problems. So the legalizing tendency of man has suppressed it again. I always say to my people when they are in difficulties, I say, this is pioneering country where you are now. We, for the first time in history, we try out to really relate men and women on a human basis. And there is bound to be a lot of error and trouble first. The modern developments of psychology don't want to abolish marriage. They want to make it a bit less tight, less tyrannically tight, especially when the children get older. Young children need a close, tightly family life, and therefore generally the biological drives knit couples together in the early part of their marriage. But after a certain while it is important, and it has probably a social motivation. If the community consists of all little happy, tightly knit families, then there is no general communal life. They are all little packages, not relating to each other, only saying my children are better than your children, so to speak. While therefore, when the children get older, there is generally a tendency of the unconscious to not dissolve marriage, but to loosen it, to demand more freedom for both partners. So I am for a certain freedom for the men, but just as much for the women. Well, the question is fidelity what the law decides, namely that you may not go to bed with another partner, which might mean nothing. Jung said you can commit adultery sometimes by just looking into somebody's eyes lovingly, and that might mean more than having a bed affair, which means nothing. So what is adultery? What is fidelity? Fidelity is, I think, has to be something not so defined in a purely outer way. It is a kind of, to me, fidelity is a basic loyalty to the essence of the other person. Loyalty without compromise to the innermost heart of the other, of the partner. But that doesn't exclude that one takes a certain freedom and leaves the other to have a certain freedom. On the contrary, if one loves the other really, one wants him to be free. One wants not to put him on a leash like a dog. There is an essential difference between the dreams of very young people and of aging people. And in the middle of life there is a transition stage where it's mixed up, but you can say that in general, in very young people, the dreams try to help them to adapt to life. There is an outward moving towards adaptation of life to fulfill the love life, the personal ambition, the ego identity, and all these goals of the first half of life. And then the more people are aging after 35, 40 years old, there is an adaptation towards the inner life, finding one's own meaning of life. But nowadays even that becomes sometimes urgent with young people. We are so crushed by the mass-mindedness of our civilizations due to the problem of overpopulation. Everybody feels superfluous. Everybody feels if I would be removed to the cemetery, that would change nothing in the whole reality. Mankind would just teem on this planet, and there would be just one less who eats the food, and that would be really a blessing. So the mass-mindedness and our whole situation crushes us and makes us feel superfluous and unimportant. In our professional life, we can always be replaced by 20 others who want the same post. There's a bustling around about having the same position. And that has a very destructive effect on modern man. Either he compensates it by becoming ambitious and megalomaniac and wanting to be the top dog to at least achieve something, or he feels completely crushed and superfluous, and there's a kind of sneaky depression coming up in him. And that sneaky depression you find, for instance, nowadays in many young people. They are kind of in a hidden way deeply depressed and discouraged. They don't believe in their own life and in the meaning of their own existence. Now all the dreams center around pointing out to the individual the meaning, the unique meaning of its unique life. And that is perhaps the most important aspect of dream life. It is as if you can say in a forest there are 2,000 trees, but if you look at it closer and accurately, every tree is a personality. Not two trees are the same. They are all personalities. And nature becomes real or fulfills its patterns in unique, individuated beings. That's why statistical thinking is so detrimental, so harmful. We say in this heap there are stones of 1 kilo of weight, but if you look at the stone heap itself, there's not one stone which is 1 kilo. One is 2 kilos and one is ½ kilo and so on. And we have to learn again to look at the uniqueness of the real thing. Reality consists of an enormous amount of unique beings, and dreams help us to find the unique pattern of our life. That's why one of the most frequent complaints in modern psychological practice is that people say, my life has no meaning. And they shrug their shoulders, they say, my life has no meaning. What for? What am I there for? What's the use of it all? I could just as well not exist. And there the dream are a unique help to point out what the unconscious wants of that person, namely what it wants that person to become. And that's often very surprising. I try sometimes to guess when some people comes to me. They say, what will come out of them? Is that a creative problem, or will that girl who is so unhappily in love get her Jack or John, or will, and so on. I never guess right. It's always a complete surprise what comes out of it. But after the event, you say, that is now uniquely the solution for that person. That's not a collective solution. That's why we feel sometimes very discouraged in publishing case material, because people think, that's the solution of a depressive problem, or that's the solution of an unhappy marriage problem, or so on. It isn't. It is only the solution for that person, of that case, and in another case it's different. That's why it's even dangerous to publish case material, in a way, because people identify and think it's their solution, and it's not their solution. It's that other person's solution. It's every time surprising and unique, and that makes the work on dreams so exciting, because it never repeats, and you can never guess. It's always a creative answer of nature. I think the theological idea of predestination is based on a feeling that there is a pre-existing pattern, and there is naturally a lot of a human life has a pre-existing pattern. If you only think of the fact that you are born as a man or a woman, and that you are born as a white man or a Chinese man, or that you are born in this place and not in another place, and that you are born in this family and not in another, there is already a lot is predestined through that. There is a given pattern. But there is also a certain leeway of freedom. Otherwise there would be no therapy. Otherwise we could give up therapy and say people have to fulfill the pattern of their life anyhow, so what? You can't change it. And that's not true. By making the pattern, by reading the pattern through the dreams and making them conscious, we can give it certain turns. We can, in a way, not escape our fate, but we can give it a more positive turn. It makes a difference if we say yes to our fate and fulfill it positively, as if we are resisting it and dragged to it. And so we can say there is a certain predestination, but it's not absolute. It's not like the fatalistic idea of Allah has decided it and it'll just go that way. We can And that's why therapy has a meaning. We can, by understanding the pattern of our life, change it a bit and avoid certain negative consequences of it. Give it a relatively more positive aspect. Well, the difficulty is that nobody has by nature a very good estimation of his values. Nobody knows how much or how little he or she is. I mean, ask anybody now, honestly, are you a great person or are you a small person? How small, how great are you compared to others? They would have to admit that they have no idea. It is a subjective feeling. Either one has an inferiority feeling and one feels the last worm on earth, or one has a superiority complex and then one feels one is elected far above the average. One has to achieve something special, and most people switch between those two. In neurotic people it's extreme, and in normal people it's less extreme, but everybody has days where he feels lousy and below the weather and a nobody, and days where one feels on top of the world, so to speak. That is a natural swing back and forth, and one could call a normal personality where the estimation of oneself is approximately reasonable compared to what one has achieved, who one is, how the surroundings see to one, and so on. But it's a very indefinite thing, really. Any lack of balance in this respect, when it goes either too far below the mark or too far above the mark, has an irritating effect on the surrounding. If one wants to know if one has an inflation, one has to only see if one gets on people's nerves. Then one is probably a bit overestimating oneself. Or underestimating oneself, because that's the same thing. If one has an inferiority complex, it's really ambition. One wants to be more than one is. One wants to be a great person and knows one isn't, and therefore one feels the last worm on earth. That is just a veiled inflation. Inferiority is a veiled inflation, and therefore also gets on people's nerves. When people sometimes come in and say, oh, well, you know, I don't know, I can't do it. How do you think I can do this? You know, I'm not capable, I'm so stupid, I can't think, and so on. Now, stop that nonsense. Get on with your job. They are really making a conceited dance in form of calling themselves incapable. So it has, again, this irritating effect. So the only measure one can have, because nobody knows who is in the last view of life, before God, so to speak, who is important or is not important. Nobody knows. It is easier to admire a great personality and become a pupil or follower of a guru or a religious prophet or an admirer of a big personality, a president of the States, or give your life for a general whom you admire. That is easier than to follow your own star, because to follow your own star means isolation, not knowing where to go, having to find out a completely new way for yourself instead of just going on the trodden path everybody else runs along. And that's why there has always been a tendency in men to rather project the uniqueness and the greatness of their own inner self onto outer personalities and become the servants, devoted servants of outer personalities, admirers and servants and imitators. Let's first see the positive side. If the self is projected, one falls into a tremendous state of admiring the person onto whom one projects the self, a kind of incredible fascination and devotion to that person. And that can have the advantage of being capable of learning. If one projects the self, for instance, onto somebody who is really wise or superior, one can learn a lot. That is even the secret of many miraculous cures, that people project the self onto a healer personality, and in the incredible fascination and faith they have into that healer personality, from that faith they are cured from all sorts of psychological or psychosomatic illnesses. So then it serves as a vehicle of promoting the individual. Much more frequently, however, this fascination leads to an infantile giving up oneself and being, so to speak, flat on one's belly before the other person, worshipping the great leader or the great spiritual guru or whatever the projection is, and losing oneself in an infantile way and remaining infantile. Such people are generally very fanatical in the admiration of that admired person, defending that person against the enemies and so on, and basking in the glory of their master or admired person through identification. And that saves these people from making an effort themselves. The great man or the great woman out there is going to do it all for me, and my task is to only applaud and admire the thing. I have to make no effort to become more intelligent or more wise or more independent myself. So it can just annihilate the personality and make them infantile instead of make them grow up and develop them. It naturally depends a bit from the person onto whom the projection of the self falls. If that person has an inflation and misuses it to breed admirers and followers, it has disastrous consequences. But I know also that there are in the Far East sometimes masters who know about the dangers of the infantile dependence and send those novices and pupils back to their own inner task and don't take the projection, so to speak. You have either monarchies or leader dictatorships. The kings of all countries, down even to the chief of a primitive tribe, are carriers of the symbol of the self. And you have all the advantages and disadvantages of a monarchical system. The advantages are that such a tribe or population has a unifying symbol of the self which holds them together. That is a projected symbol of the self, and because it's such a deeply rooted need in man to have such a living symbol of the self. Naturally, for Catholics, the Pope very often represents the symbol of the self as being more of a spiritual leadership than worldly leadership. But that's a split situation in the West. But because there is such a need, you have now, since monarchy has been mostly abolished, we have all the dictators, Napoleon, Hitler. We have always these leader figures which show that people want again or need to project the self onto some leader figure. And that, according to Jung, is an infantile gesture. It's because we want to remain children. We don't want to take the responsibility. Democracy is a very difficult task because it puts the responsibility on everybody, and most people don't want to take political responsibility. They don't want to wreck their brains, but they prefer to think the father state will do it all right. So one likes to project onto a leader. We have a group of leaders, and they are father figures, and they are the self, and they do it all right. Just mental and psychological laziness. Laziness is, Jung once said, that's the greatest passion of mankind, even greater than power and sex and anything. That in general primitives are less technologically and rationally oriented, and therefore have a more natural outlook on life and on death and on their own inner life. They are better related to their instinctual life, as long as they are not disturbed by our technological civilization. And therefore, we have the urgent need to return to a similar way of life. They can show us, by their more natural and more wholesome reactions, what we have lost. We have become too lopsidedly intellectual, and therefore that's why we don't relate anymore to our dreams, or we think in waking up our dreams are silly dreams or absurd dreams or nonsense. That's our first impression. While primitive man, who has more symbolic thinking, and generally also through his tribal traditions, he has more mythological and symbolic knowledge, he has a better relationship to his dreams, and that means he has a better relationship to his inner life, to his instinctual life.